Hey listeners, you're listening to Delve, a management podcast from McGill University where we want to change how you think about management. So my name's Eric DeCare and I'm Delve's managing editor, and I'm very excited to introduce you to today's conversation about an incredibly important topic, the end of oil. So you're about to hear a conversation between two experts in the worlds of sustainability and management. So the first is Professor Javad Nasiry, a professor of operations management and director of the Sustainable Growth Initiative here at McGill. And the second is Ryan Kellogg, a professor from the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. So Ryan wrote a paper in 2024 anticipating that oil companies are going to divest from oil production long term instead of prioritizing short-term profits. So a year on, it feels like a lot has changed. So does he still believe this is going to happen? So Javad and Ryan cover a lot of ground in this episode, basically tracing a roadmap to net zero in the next 75 years. So special thanks to Professor Nasiry for stepping in to guest host today. So here he is talking to Professor Ryan Kellogg about the end of oil. So let's delve into it.
Professor Ryan Kellogg, welcome to the Delve podcast.
Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
In a 2024 working paper with the provocative title, The End of Oil, you presented a model that suggests the oil companies, the oil sector, will move towards divestment rather than short-term profits. Could you please explain in simple terms how this result comes about?
Yeah, so what the paper does is it sort of tries to frame out in a world where it becomes like really commonly understood that demand for oil really has begun this decline. And sort of in some sense, everybody agrees that demand is declining. I don't think that's the world we are in right now, sitting here in 2025. Is it going to be a world we find ourselves in 10 years? Possibly. And we can, it's interesting to think about that. If and when we get into that world, how are oil producers going to react to the knowledge that, hey, the party days are over and people are buying EVs and demand is going down? And what the paper really does is it sort of plays off the disinvestment effect against the green paradox.
Could you please describe what green paradox and also divestment are?
When environmental economists talk about the notion of a green paradox, what that often comes in the context of is a worry about climate policy actually backfiring and leading to more greenhouse gas emissions rather than less. The idea is in some sense very intuitive when you think about it. And it's sort of based on the notion that suppose you are an oil producer and you're sitting on top of a reserve of oil that you control, and there's sort of a fixed stock of oil that you control that's sitting below the ground, and you're trying to decide, do I drill for how much oil do I produce today? How much oil do I produce next year? How much the year after that? So on and so forth, knowing that at some point you're going to run out. Now imagine yourself as that oil producer, and a policymaker comes along and tells you that, hey, you know, you've been enjoying robust demand for oil for all these years and good oil prices, but you know what? We're going to enact a bunch of climate policies that are going to make it expensive for people to drive gasoline-powered cars, and instead they're all going to want to drive EVs, and nobody's going to want to buy oil anymore, and this is going to start really happening in another 5 or 10 years. You get told that, you're an oil producer. What's that going to give you an incentive to do? Well, now you're going to revise your production plan and say, hey, actually, I had been planning on continuing to produce oil and conserving it a little bit so I could still be producing in 5-10 years. But now you're telling me no one's going to want it then. Well, I'm going to revise my plan. And instead of being patient and spreading my production out, I'm going to try to get this stuff out of the ground as fast as I possibly can and really ramp up my production now. And that is the essence of the green paradox, that climate policy or new clean technologies that come into place with some kind of lag or delay, or they evolve gradually, with the idea of reducing emissions. What you're really going to do, because fossil fuels are exhaustible, finite resources, you're just going to induce extractors to get the oil out of the ground sooner rather than later. And you're actually not on net really going to reduce emissions not that much at all, and possibly not at all, period.
And how does this contrast with divestment in the oil industry?
Yeah, so divestment is an alternative sort of idea that actually has almost exactly the opposite. It has exactly the opposite direction of a green paradox. So now again, imagine yourself as an oil producer. The policymaker tells you that, hey, demand for your product is going to go away in 5-10 years because of these clean energy policies I'm going to put into place. You might want to get more oil out of the ground, but a problem you're going to have as an oil producer is simply the fact that the oil industry, like basically all fossil fuel industries, is extremely capital intensive. If you're going to produce more oil, what you have to do is make some upfront investments in things like drilling an oil well, building some surface facilities, maybe constructing a pipeline, a bunch of other types of capital, some of which might be short-lived, some of which might be very long-lived. What does that mean? It means that if in the context of our policymaker who's trying to tell you, hey, we're going to have climate policy that's really stringent in 5-10 years, well, that's really going to decrease my appetite as an oil producer to make these kind of long-lived capital investments. If the capital's still going to be around in 5-10 years, you've devalued that investment. I'm going to be less likely to make that investment. The upshot being, from a climate perspective, is that disinvestment is actually a story by which future climate policy, anticipated clean technology, actually reduces fossil fuel investment and hence fossil fuel production in the near term, even before the policy actually really kicks in.
So if I understood your viewpoint, the main drive behind this will be also the investments in new technologies that are going to drive also so when people are making choices, they would be more willing to consider other sources of energy, for example, electric cars rather than internal combustion engine cars. So would you say this is the major change or change that has happened in the past 20, 25 years that makes this divestment a realistic outcome?
I would say the change has happened even just within the past 5 years. And like, I think nothing encapsulates it in terms of facts better than just like a basic fact. Say, if you go to China right now and look at new car sales in China, more than half of new car sales are either plug-in electric hybrids or full battery electric vehicles. And of that half, more than half are full-on BEVs, where there just isn't a gas tank, period. It's just the battery. Like, these vehicles are taking off in one of the biggest and most important markets of the world. And on top of that, China is beginning to export, major producers in China are beginning to export their electric vehicles to other parts of the world. They're showing up in Europe, they're showing up in India, they're showing up in other in other emerging economies. And I think the big question for the future path of oil demand, at least over the next 10 years or so, is really going to be for emerging economies, in particular, places like India, for example, that are really starting to begin to demand vehicles for personal transportation in ways that were just not the case at all 10, 15 years ago. Are they going to go down the same road that, say, the US, Canada, Western Europe went down, where personal transportation was satisfied by the internal combustion engine? Or are they going to go down an alternative path where electric vehicles are going to be the dominant form that satisfies transportation needs, at least for personal vehicle use? That's the question. I don't think we know the answer to that yet. I think we're going to learn a lot over the next 5 to 10 years how that's going to proceed, and that's going to be a pretty strong signal for what's going to happen to the path of oil demand.
In the next few years, say 5 to 10 years that you mentioned, one of the drivers to provide an answer in which direction we may be able to go is how much investment in alternative sources of energy will be made. And I'm curious to know your opinion on, given the recent changes in political landscape, whether that investment will be significant enough to make divestment a more likely outcome.
I think a lot of attention, and I think rightly so, has been paid to some like the big changes in policy that have occurred in the U.S. under the new Trump administration and its allies in both the House and Senate and Congress. All that said, I think it's important to remember, yes, the U.S. is big. It's a big policy mover, but it is but one part of the world. The story of energy and climate over the course of the century is really going to be written by what happens in emerging economies, because that's where we're going to see the growth in energy demand, sort of energy demand in sort of countries that in large, rich countries is more or less flat to a first approximation. A lot of the action is going to be happening in emerging economies, and they're going to be the ones to watch. And it's going to be important to think about what is their willingness to adopt new green technologies, whether it's solar, batteries for wholesale grid storage, electric vehicles, all of that, demand side management, you name it. What is going to be the ability of these types of countries to adopt these technologies? That's going to be a function of just raw technological progress, the science and engineering that goes into it. Another important factor is going to be how sort of socio-economic systems build up that actually allows people to come and adopt these technologies. And a lot of that's going to come from markets.
Absolutely. So the more these developing countries where the increase in energy demand is, the more these countries move towards other sources of energy, renewable energy or sustainable sources of energy, the more likely it is that we will be able to get to a stage where the demand for oil comes down and we have other more plausible substitutes in order to control the impact on the environment. Is that a good summary of basically?
Yeah, that's a good summary. And maybe just to give one more concrete example, like you think about a country like India. It's an extremely hot place. It goes without saying. It's a place that is already suffering in terms of human health impacts from extreme heat. That's only going to get worse under climate change. One way people in India are trying to deal with that is by adopting a lot more air conditioning. And there's a large mass of people in India that are becoming wealthy enough that they can start to actually purchase air conditioners, which is like, when you think about it, it's a really transformative thing when you live in a place where it's extremely hot many, many months of the year. That's going to drive large increases in energy demand. Air conditioning is extremely energy intensive, particularly in a setting like India where it's hot and the thing is running a lot. That means that in order to really have reductions in CO2 overall, in a world where we have energy demand growing for exactly this kind of reason, that really sort of doubles down the need for, as the grid in places like India expands, are we going to build that grid on clean energy, or is that grid going to be built on coal?
So getting back to the to oil companies and their incentives, the International Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, calls for net zero by 2050. Do you believe we have time for the oil sector to come around to divestment on its own?
By 2050? That seems a little ambitious. Okay, that seems wildly ambitious, just to be blunt about it. One way to think about that is there's a huge number of vehicles that are already out there on the road. I don't have the number on the tip of my tongue, but hundreds of millions of vehicles are already out on the road. The vast majority of them are internal combustion engine. Absent some kind of really strong public policy that incentivizes people to get rid of their old cars, either through carrots or sticks, people are going to want to continue demanding fossil fuels, in particular for transportation, gasoline and diesel, for quite some time. You look at the electric grid, there's a lot of infrastructure around coal and natural gas. These things take time to unwind. In the paper where I look at disinvestment in the green paradox, these sort of timescales are one reason that when I model a demand for oil going away in that paper, I do it over a 75-year time frame, not 25 years. So 75 years gets us to the end of the century. 25 years would be something in line with a 2050 kind of goal. When we think about demand for fossil fuels going away over a time frame where we're really talking about going out to the end of the century, not just the next couple decades, we're going to have to grapple with the fact that There's already a lot of CO2 in the air. The climate has already changed. It's in fact going to continue to change because emissions are not going to fall to zero overnight. It's simply not practical. So we're going to need to think through, given the changes in temperatures and the consequences that are going to come from the climate change, then in some sense is just baked in. How are we going to deal with that? How are we going to fund adaptation for the people who really need it? To what extent do we need to go for alternative technologies that really fall into the realm of climate engineering, either in the form of direct air capture or removal of carbon from the atmosphere that's already there, or ideas like actually changing the nature of the climate through things like stratospheric aerosol injection and deliberately trying to make the Earth cooler.
Wow. So building on that last remark, so if the oil sector does not come around to divest in response to the market and political landscape, at least the way we see it these days, this tends to negate all the other activities that are being done in order to bring down the emissions. So the overall impact of all the other efforts could be not so helpful to bring down the emissions and the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So how do you see this playing out?
Yeah, I mean, if oil companies aren't sort of reducing emissions, I mean, the reason that comes about is because people are still buying oil. I would say the same is going to be true for coal. The same would be true for natural gas. All of which is just coming about from the fact that fossil fuels are abundant and relatively low cost, and at least in places where the infrastructure is fairly well set up, they're pretty reliable. You go to the gas station, you can be pretty confident that they're actually going to have gas. And when you press the trigger on the pump, gasoline's going to come out. The way to get that out of the system is by sort of setting up public policy incentives such that people are actually willing to use the alternative fuels, and that companies are willing to set up businesses that are based around supplying and delivering clean energy technologies. That can come from sticks, i.e. penalizing fossil fuels through either a carbon tax. It can come from carrots, like actually subsidizing clean energy technologies, EV subsidies, solar subsidies, things of that ilk. But it's sort of really all about sort of bending the curve of technology such that when people demand energy services, just because like energy is like a critical input to everything we do in our lives, whether it's our productive work lives or for our home lives or holidays, you name it. How are people going to find energy that's actually produced in an environmentally friendly way and that doesn't break the bank?
Absolutely, and hopefully it doesn't come at the cost of increasing the prices for the final customers. So that has been a pain point, of course, in Canada, at least with the carbon tax that is being transferred to households. And that's a major discussion on whether this is fair on the families and who should be bearing the brunt of controlling the emissions. So one thing that comes to mind is, so it's not all about the oil industry and oil production. It's also about the consequences of divesting in the oil sector on the other industries that depend on oil. So, for example, we could be thinking of agricultural machinery or accessibility in rural areas and so on and so forth. What will be the consequence of divestment for those sectors that critically depend on oil and oil products?
Yeah. I think for sectors like that, I can certainly imagine it's like sectors where it's very hard to find reliable substitutes for oil. I think aviation would be another one. The sustainable aviation fuel might be a viable substitute there. Certainly some petrochemicals are another area where it might be really hard to substitute away from oil. I would see those sort of sectors as sort of being the last sort of consumption areas where we get out after personal vehicles, after trucking, after trains, after all of that. Maybe there's a small oil industry that continues, designed to serve exactly those kinds of more niche uses. That would be much smaller oil sector than what we have now. And maybe that's fine at the end of the day. Like if you think about agricultural machinery, transportation in very remote areas where sort of having an electric vehicle is not necessarily all that practical if you're driving very, very long distances and through areas where you don't have an electric grid. That may well continue, in a world where we're getting 90% of the oil out of the 90% less oil than what we're consuming now, and getting that out, maybe that's fine at the end of the day. And it's just too costly to substitute away from every single use.
So let's end on a positive note, Ryan. What's happening in the world right now that makes you optimistic about the future of climate?
Yeah. For me, I think it's just there's a continued march of adoption of these newer technologies that I don't think was really foreseen 10 years ago. It might have been hoped for, but it wasn't foreseen. In particular, I think of just the wild decreases in the costs of solar photovoltaics and batteries that continue to drive adoption and installation of solar. Solar, we see it in the U.S. We're going to keep seeing it in the U.S., even with some of the withdrawals of the public support. And we're seeing that throughout the world. I would have never predicted 10 years ago that now more than half of all vehicles sold in China are at least plug-in hybrids, if not full battery electric vehicles, and that China's turned into a major exporter of that technology. And they're building cars that, by all accounts, are high quality and cheaper than their internal combustion engine counterparts, and people are happily buying them, even in the absence of a direct-to-consumer subsidy. Like, these are things that are happening. Firms are investing real money and continuing to develop and try to deploy and develop business models around the deployment of all of this. Those are the things that give me hope.
Professor Ryan Kellogg, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, and that's the show. So that was Professor Javad Nasiry, Director of the Sustainable Growth Initiative here at McGill, stepping in to guest host on today's episode and doing a tremendous job. And Professor Ryan Kellogg, visiting us from the University of Chicago and sharing his insights on the end of oil. So special thanks to them both. So to read Professor Kellogg's working paper on the end of oil, I'm going to leave a link in the description for you. And if you liked what you heard today, there's a lot more where that came from. So twice a month, we publish deep, insightful, and challenging conversations with management experts from across sectors. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. So my name is Eric DeCare. I'm Delve's managing editor, and I produced this episode. Professor Saku Montara is Delve's editor-in-chief, and he produced all the original music on this podcast. Some more management insights are on the way, so be sure to stick with us, and we will see you next time.